Elena O'Brien built her platform on beauty, nostalgia, and the fantasy of timeless art. With millions of views and a rapidly growing following across TikTok and Instagram, she positioned herself as something rare on the internet, a living Renaissance painting, a muse, someone artists admired, studied, and poured hours of free labor into, not because they were asked to, but because they wanted to. And for a while it worked. Artists didn't just draw her, they elevated her, they amplified her, they helped turn an aesthetic into a career. But unlike the Monalisa, that image didn't last, and the illusion didn't survive close inspection, because the same creator who invited thousands of artists to draw her for free would later partner with AI. Technology accused of stealing from those very artists.
Imagine me as a Renaissance painting.
And as the backlash grew, so did the revelations. Old likes, private messages, political statements. A Halloween costume, many say, crossed the line into blackface. Claims of European nationalism from an Australian creator. Dismissal of Gaza as propaganda. Comments suggesting racial beauty hierarchies. What started as disappointment over an AI sponsorship quickly unraveled into something far darker. Today we're breaking down the rise and fall of Elena O'Brien. From the Draw Me movement that launched her into viral fame, to all the accusations of betrayal and racism that turned her own community against her. Because when your entire brand is built on admiration, the moment people stop projecting goodness onto you, everything underneath gets exposed. Before the backlash, before the partnerships, before the screenshots and DMs, Elena O'Brien existed online as a very specific idea. An Australian content creator posting under the usernames Elena and Elena28 on TikTok and Instagram, she did not rise through humor, commentary, or the traditional influencer trends. Her appeal was visual and immediate. Viewers fixated on her face first. Soft, rounded features, pale, rosy skin, a look that many commenters repeatedly compared to women depicted in Renaissance and early modern paintings. Across multiple platforms, the comparison became constant. She was described as looking like a figure pulled straight from a gallery wall, a time capsule in motion, a painting that somehow learned how to speak. Elena recognized that reaction almost immediately and built her identity around it. Her content leaned hard into Renaissance and medieval aesthetics. She dressed as a maiden from another era, wearing flowing garments, corseted silhouettes, and vintage-looking fabrics she often claimed were thrifted. She incorporated handheld fans, deliberate posture, and stylized gestures meant to evoke historical portraiture. Many of her videos followed a recurring visual ritual. She would begin completely still, frozen in place like a finished oil painting, before slowly animating into speech. In others, she would reverse the effect, starting animated and exaggerated, then settling into a sultry, composed pose as if slipping back into the frame. This contrast became part of her appeal. Despite resembling the stoic, silent women immortalized in classic art, Elena was expressive and talkative. She gesticulated, smiled, joked, and spoke directly to her audience.
Ma'am, maybe a DNA test because she's deaf your ancestor. Well, we actually looked into this and research says that Elizabeth Plantagenet was actually our many great-grandmother, and her father was King Edward IV, and she was his first child but illegitimate, and 10 generations back from her there was Edward III, and he was the common connector to the family side that Catherine of Aragon belonged to, so says Google. So there we go. We're actually related.
She did not act like a museum piece. She felt modern while visually belonging to the past. That postmodern tension became her trademark. Her image also positioned her in opposition to contemporary beauty culture. Commenters praised her as an antidote to Botox, fillers, and cosmetic surgery trends. She was framed as natural, untouched, and timeless. Not manufactured, not algorithmically polished, but human in a way that felt rare online. That perception mattered. It gave her aesthetic a moral weight beyond appearance. She was not just beautiful, she was symbolically different. Alongside the visual branding, Elena publicly aligned herself with values that reinforced this image. She expressed appreciation for arts and artists. She leaned into thrifting, which signaled sustainability and anti-consumerist sentiment. According to multiple accounts, she also expressed anti-AI views prior to the controversy, placing herself in ideological proximity to human creativity and traditional artistry. Whether casually or deliberately, she positioned herself as someone who stood with artists, not corporations, with creators, not machines. By the time her account began gaining real traction, Elena was not just seen as an influencer, she was seen as a muse, a figure people projected meaning onto, someone whose aesthetic implied integrity, cultural sensitivity, and artistic respect before she ever said a word about any of those things. The moment that transformed Elena from an aesthetic creator into a viral sensation was not a brand deal, a trend, or a polished campaign. It was a comment. Under one of her videos, a viewer wrote a simple observation: "You look so drawable." Instead of ignoring it or responding with a like, Elena turned that comment into content. She filmed a response video that would become the foundation of her rise.
"You look so drawable. I would love to be drawn." Everyone commenting, asking for permission, you do not have to. Just tag me, I would love to see it. Draw me, paint me, make video edits, and I'll repost them as well. I love you.
She told artists they did not need permission. She encouraged them to draw her, paint her, edit her, interpret her likeness however they wanted. All she asked was to be tagged. She promised to repost their work and celebrate it publicly. This was not framed as a contest or a commission. It was framed as a muse offering herself freely to the community. The response was overwhelming. Artists flooded TikTok and Instagram with drawings of Elena in every imaginable style. Traditional pencil sketches, digital portraits, oil-style paintings, stylized character designs, hyper-realistic studies, entire process videos documenting brush strokes, shading techniques, and creative decisions, all centered around her face. Some artists created multiple pieces. Others made full videos explaining how her features translated so well onto canvas. The volume was massive and sustained. What made this moment different from typical fan art trends was the scale and the labor involved. These were not quick edits or filters. These were hours-long works created by real people with real skills. And they were given freely. No payment, no contracts, no commissions, just admiration. In doing so, the artist provided Elena with 3 things that most influencers have to buy: labor, promotion, and algorithmic amplification. Every drawing posted introduced her face to a new audience. Every process video functioned as an endorsement. Every tag pushed her name further into art-focused spaces on TikTok and Instagram. The algorithm did the rest. A symbiotic relationship formed almost instantly. Elena reposted the artwork to her own pages, filling her feed with tributes to herself rendered in dozens of styles. Artists gained visibility from her audience. Elena gained exponential growth from theirs. It appeared mutually beneficial on the surface, a creator and a community lifting each other up. But beneath the goodwill was an unspoken imbalance. One side was giving time, skill, and creative labor. The other was receiving content, reach, and brand elevation. And that imbalance would later become impossible to ignore. But it's important to state that before the collapse, Elena was not just liked, she was trusted. Her interactions with followers reinforced the idea that she was kind, appreciative, and genuinely grateful for the attention she received. She spoke warmly to her audience, replied to comments, and regularly reposted fan art with praise. There was no visible arrogance, no obvious sense of entitlement. To many, she came across as friendly and grounded, someone aware that her rise was tied to the people uplifting her. That perception mattered because it shaped how everything she did was interpreted. She was not viewed as a conventional influencer chasing clout or brand deals. She was framed as a muse, a passive center around which creativity formed. Artists didn't feel like they were being marketed to. They felt inspired. That distinction is important. A muse is not supposed to exploit. A muse is supposed to exist, inspire, and appreciate. Elena fit neatly into that role in the eyes of her audience. As her platform grew, so did the composition of her followers. A large portion of her audience consisted of artists, illustrators, painters, digital creatives, many of whom were already vocal about the dangers of generative AI. This was a community that valued human labor, originality, and creative integrity. Politically and culturally, they skewed left-leaning. They were generally progressive, anti-corporate, anti-exploitation, and deeply skeptical of big tech. These were not passive consumers. They were people whose livelihoods and identities were tied to art. Because of that, expectations formed around Elena without her ever explicitly stating them. People assumed cultural sensitivity because her community demanded it. They assumed political awareness because her aesthetic was intertwined with art history, identity, and representation. They assumed alignment with progressive and artistic values because she appeared to benefit from and celebrate those values daily. Her thrifted fashion, her alleged anti-AI stance, her embrace of human-made art all reinforced that assumption. None of this was written into a contract, but it functioned like one. And when those expectations were later violated, the backlash was not just about a single decision, it was about the sudden realization that the person they thought they knew may never have existed at all. The Meta-AI partnership was the moment everything snapped. After months of being elevated by human artists, Elena appeared in a sponsored post collaborated with Meta-AI. The prompt was simple and loaded with symbolism. Imagine me as a Renaissance painting. Using her likeness, Meta's generative AI produced images designed to mimic the same old master aesthetic that thousands of real artists had already created for her by hand. This was not subtle. It was not abstract. It was a direct substitution of human labor with machine output, wrapped in the exact visual language her community had helped popularize. The context made it worse. At the time, generative AI was already widely condemned within the art community for scraping artist work without consent and using it to train models that actively replace paid creative labor. Artists had been openly protesting this technology, calling it exploitative, unethical, and destructive to their livelihoods. For a creator whose platform had been built almost entirely through free human artwork, partnering with an AI company accused of stealing from those same artists felt like a calculated insult. The response was immediate and visceral. Artists flooded her comments accusing her of betrayal. Some publicly deleted or defaced the artworks they'd made of her. Others posted videos burning drawings, scribbling over portraits, or erasing digital files on camera. These were not symbolic gestures. They were expressions of real anger and hurt from people who felt used. Many artists stated outright that they would never have drawn her if they knew she would later promote the tech threatening their careers.
As an artist who drew her, I feel so disrespected, and it's so strange to me to see that the person that asked to draw, people to draw them for free, and have some collaborations and support of the real artists, just betray somehow and prefer corporation.
The situation escalated quickly. The Meta-AI post was deleted shortly after the backlash intensified, but the removal did little to calm the outrage. At first, it was unclear whether the partnership itself had been fully terminated or if only the post had been taken down to reduce heat. That ambiguity fueled more distrust. To many, deletion without accountability felt like avoidance rather than remorse. Compounding the damage, Elena initially continued reposting fan art even as artists were calling her out. What may have once been seen as appreciation now read as tone-deaf. Reposting human-made art while simultaneously profiting from AI-generated imagery made the contradiction impossible to ignore. Instead of softening the backlash, her continued activity reinforced the perception that she did not understand or did not care about why people were upset. This was no longer just about one's sponsorship. It had become a referendum on her values. And for the first time, the image of Elena as a harmless muse began to fracture in public. As the backlash intensified, artists stopped speaking in abstractions and started confronting Elena directly. Some did it publicly in her comments. Others took the conversation into her DMs, hoping that a private setting might lead to accountability or at least acknowledgement. What they received instead was the moment trust fully collapsed. In private messages, Elena repeatedly framed the situation as a matter of survival and inevitability. She described herself as just a girl out here making a living, emphasizing that the Meta-AI post was her first major brand collaboration, and insisting that this is my job. When pressed on why she would accept a partnership that directly harmed the people who built her platform, she responded with phrases that would quickly become infamous. Beggars can't be choosers. There's no creator fund in Australia. The implication was clear. She wanted sympathy for her position, but she did not extend the same sympathy to the artists who had worked for her for free. These responses landed badly. To the artists reading them, the language felt dismissive and infantilizing. Just a girl came across not as vulnerability, but as a rhetorical shield, a way to minimize responsibility while still benefiting from power. Publicly, her comments were no better. When accused of selling out, she insisted there was no betrayal, reiterating that it was only one paid post and part of the advertising business. She argued that her reputation was about who she was as a person, not what she was selling. She told critics not to attach themselves emotionally to her paid partnerships and claimed that all true fans know where I stand. To many, that line was the final fracture. It drew a clear boundary between loyal supporters who did not question her and those who dared to criticize her decisions. Artists interpreted these statements as morally evasive. Rather than addressing the harm caused, she deflected. Rather than acknowledging exploitation, she reframed it as mutual benefit, pointing to story views and exposure as sufficient compensation. The suggestion that artists should pay her for collaborations after months of unpaid fan art only reinforced the sense that she viewed their labor transactionally and only on her terms. As criticism mounted, Elena's response shifted from defensive to restrictive. Artists reported being blocked after leaving critical comments. Comment sections were limited or locked. Disappearing messages were enabled in DMs, making conversations harder to document and easier to deny. Instead of transparency, there was containment. Instead of dialogue, there was control. At that point, the damage was irreversible. The issue is no longer just AI. The way Elena spoke to the people who built her platform revealed a gap between the image she projected and the values she practiced. For an audience that had believed she stood with them, that realization was more painful than any sponsorship ever could be. Once the Meta AI controversy cracked the image people had of Elena, the scrutiny did not stop at sponsorships. The trust had already been damaged, and with that came a shift in how people viewed everything else she had done online. What was once brushed off or ignored now became evidence. Viewers began digging through her likes, comments, and private messages, not out of idle curiosity, but because the AI incident had raised a larger question. If she was willing to betray her artist community so casually, what else had people missed? Almost immediately, screenshots began circulating. Users documented posts Elena had liked that promoted white nationalist talking points, anti-immigration rhetoric, and Islamophobic narratives. These were not vague or misinterpreted memes. They included content framing immigrants as criminals, posts celebrating deportation rhetoric, and material positioning Muslims as a threat to European society. Other likes centered on nostalgia for an imagined racially homogenous Europe, mourning what commenters described as the loss of white European dominance. These interactions were public, visible through her account, and difficult to dismiss as accidental. More alarming screenshots followed. Elena had liked posts discussing racial IQ hierarchies, a long-standing white supremacist talking point used to justify discrimination and racial inequality. This was no longer about edgy opinions or poor judgment. It was about alignment with explicitly racist ideology. Private messages reinforced the public evidence. In multiple DM exchanges that later surfaced, Elena addressed political topics directly. When challenged about her views on immigration and global conflict, she framed war and humanitarian crisis as distant quarrels while centering her concern on the perceived decline of Europe. In one exchange after another, she complained about migrants being housed, fed, and supported by taxpayers, linked immigration to rising crime, and dismissed footage of civilian suffering as staged propaganda. Across these conversations, one line appeared again and again in slightly different forms. "I suppose I would side with nationalism." That statement spread rapidly. People pointed out the contradiction immediately. Elena is Australian. She does not live in Europe. She does not hold European citizenship. Yet she repeatedly expressed anxiety over European borders, European culture, and European racial identity. The fixation felt ideological rather than personal, rooted in online nationalist spaces rather than lived experience. The whole thing had now turned into a full ideological reckoning. The audience was no longer debating whether one sponsorship was a mistake. They were questioning whether the values they had projected onto Elena had ever been real at all. As more private messages surfaced, Elena's stance on Gaza and Palestine became one of the most disturbing elements of the fallout. In multiple DM exchanges, she dismissed footage coming out of Gaza as staged, describing it as sympathy propaganda designed to manipulate emotions. Rather than engaging with the scale of civilian suffering, she referred to the situation as a quarrel in a faraway country between people we know nothing about. Despite the extensive historical documentation of the conflict and its humanitarian consequences, her framing consistently shifted focus away from civilian deaths and toward immigration. In these messages, she emphasized fears about refugees using war as a pathway into Europe, complaining about migrants being housed, fed, and supported by taxpayers. She linked immigration to crime, bombings, and social decline, repeatedly centering the perceived threat to European stability rather than the loss of life that was driving displacement in the first place. Children dying in Gaza were treated as an abstract footnote, while border control and nationalism took priority in her responses. Elena claimed to oppose war and propaganda while simultaneously dismissing real footage of suffering and amplifying narratives that dehumanized refugees. By framing displaced people as opportunists or invaders rather than victims of violence, she reduced human lives to political inconveniences. For many, this confirmed that her nationalism was not abstract or aesthetic. It had real consequences in how she viewed other people's humanity. At the same time, another controversy added fuel to the fire. Elena had applied to a Vogue open casting call and shared the submission publicly. In the comment section of that post, someone wrote, "White girls will always be better looking." Elena liked the comment. Screenshots of the interaction spread quickly, especially because the post included her standing beside a darker-skinned model, making the implication impossible to ignore. Many accused her of endorsing beauty supremacy and racial hierarchy, not just privately, but in public view. The idea that her rise had been framed around being an alternative to modern beauty standards now looked hollow. When confronted, Elena denied liking the comment and claimed the screenshot was fabricated. That denial did little to slow the backlash. By that point, trust was already broken, and the denial was seen less as clarification and more as damage control. Together, the Gaza discourse and the Vogue incident shifted the narrative permanently. It simply took one sponsorship for people to start looking closely enough to see it. The Halloween cosplay controversy became the visual proof many critics felt they no longer needed to argue hypotheticals. Elena posted a Halloween look that featured her face and body darkened, paired with exaggerated red lips. She labeled the character Queen of Crows and later referred to it as a biblically accurate dark angel. The imagery immediately set off alarms. The combination of darkened skin and red lips has a long and well-documented history tied to blackface and minstrel imagery, regardless of costume intent or fantasy framing. When backlash began, Elena defended herself by insisting she was literally a crow. She explained that the dark coloring was meant to represent feathers and that she was not attempting to appear dark-skinned. In her view, grouping her costume with blackface was insulting and hateful. She maintained that there was no malicious intent behind the look and framed the criticism as a misunderstanding. That explanation did not exactly hold. Critics argued that intent was not the deciding factor. Blackface is defined by its visual and historical context, not by what the person wearing it claims to mean. The moment you darken your face and pair it with red lips, you are evoking imagery that's been used for centuries to dehumanize and mock black people. This is widely understood, particularly in online spaces where discussions of race and representation are common. Ignorance, critics argued, was not a defense, especially not for someone whose career depended on cultural aesthetics and visual symbolism. What removed any remaining benefit of the doubt was the pattern. By this point, Elena had already been exposed, liking racist and nationalist content, endorsing anti-immigration rhetoric, and dismissing the suffering of Palestinians. In that context, the costume could no longer be treated as an isolated mistake. It read as consistent with her broader worldview. The crow explanation felt less like clarification and more like plausible deniability. For many viewers, this was the moment ambiguity ended. Even those who had tried to separate aesthetic ignorance from ideological intent stopped doing so. The costume did not exist in a vacuum. It existed alongside her likes, her messages, and her statements. And taken together, they painted a picture that could no longer be explained away as accidental or naive. Under mounting pressure, Elena eventually released a multi-slide apology intended to address every major controversy at once. The statement covered the Met AI partnership, the environmental impact of generative AI, the Halloween costume accusations, her views on immigration, and the harassment she claimed to be experiencing. On the surface, it read like a comprehensive response. In practice, it deepened the divide over how sincere she actually was. Regarding Meta AI, she apologized for letting the art community down and described the partnership as a one-off advertisement contract that had been terminated, with the post taken down. She stated that she had failed to research the existential harm caused by AI and framed this as a personal education gap she now intended to correct. She acknowledged environmental concerns such as water scarcity and promised never to work with artistic AI again. She insisted that no artworks had been fed into AI models, only images of herself. and emphasized that she understood the effort and compassion required to make art because she considered herself a qualified artist. She then addressed the blackface accusations. Elena said she was sorry to the black community and claimed she had no intention of doing blackface, admitting that she did no prior research into the issue. She announced that all related videos would be taken down and added that she now understood how serious the situation was. Notably, she described the pattern as an error and how the look may be perceived, a phrase that stood out to critics as deflecting responsibility away from the act itself. On immigration and ideology, she denied being a Zionist or a white supremacist and stated she was only against illegal immigration. She claimed not to align with extremist groups or ideologies and said she was sorry to anyone offended. The framing focused heavily on offense rather than harm, and it avoided addressing the specific posts she had liked or the content of her private messages. Finally, she spoke about bullying and harassment. She said she would not tolerate further bullying toward herself or artists who had drawn her, referenced death threats she claimed to have received, and stated that she forgave those responsible. She insisted she would continue supporting artists and posting fan art, once again asserting that she had always supported artists from the beginning. She also offered to remove artworks from her highlights if artists requested it. The language patterns throughout the apology were consistent. Phrases like no intention, error in how it may be perceived, and repeated references to being a qualified artist appeared multiple times. To many critics, this read as evasive and self-protective rather than accountable. Some argued that the apology centered her feelings, her learning curve, and her suffering while minimizing the concrete harm caused to marginalized groups and to the artists she had relied on. By the time the apology dropped, though, the damage had already been done. For many former supporters, the issue was no longer whether she apologized correctly. It was whether they believed the version of Elena presented in that statement had ever aligned with the person they thought they were supporting in the first place. Artists who had once celebrated Elena began publicly distancing themselves from her. Some filmed themselves scribbling over portraits, burning sketches, or deleting digital files they had spent hours creating. Others posted videos explicitly renouncing any association with her name or image, making it clear that they no longer wanted their work linked to her platform. What had once been a collective act of admiration turned into a collective act of withdrawal. The audience fractured along familiar lines. A large portion of viewers argued that Elena should be permanently deplatformed. Not suspended, not forgiven, not rehabilitated, removed. They pointed to the pattern of behavior, the ideological alignment, and the dismissive responses as proof that the harm was not accidental and that continuing to give her reach only amplified dangerous ideas. Others pushed back against that position. They argued that growth requires the opportunity to change and that permanent exile from the internet leaves no room for learning. This group viewed the apology as sufficient, or at least as a starting point. They framed Elena as young, overwhelmed, and unequipped to handle sudden fame, insisting that the backlash had crossed into cruelty and that no one deserved to be defined forever by their worst moments. Elena herself did not meaningfully change course. She continued posting the same Renaissance-inspired content that had originally made her famous. The aesthetic remained intact, but the response did not. Views dropped, engagement thinned, comment sections stayed restricted. The sense of enchantment that once surrounded her content was gone. Without the artist community amplifying her work, the algorithmic momentum disappeared.